Chapter 8, Prelude to Wedding, 1. Queen Victoria was in a small room in Buckingham Palace with her mother, Lady Emma Portman, Harriet Sutherland, and Leyson. On that day the Queen was ill, still sad and depressed by her tense farewell to Lord Melbourne when he went to the country house of his friend, distressed and anxious for his imminent return, and sick. The Queen was increasingly manifesting serious discomfort for her pregnancy, and that made her feel angry and scared. The situation also generated restlessness in the loyal women who surrounded her at that time. With dissimulation, the eyes of the Duchess, Leyson, Emma, and Harriet were fixed in Victoria, and looked for signs of pregnancy. Although the clothes specially adapted by Mrs. Jenkins with the help of Scarrett concealed her condition, for a shrewd eye began to notice that the Queen gained weight. If things did not go fast enough and the wedding with Lord Melbourne was not coming soon, the consequences would be disastrous because it would be impossible to hide the Queen's pregnancy. The women sincerely loved the Queen, each in her own way and in varying degrees, but all worried about the danger hanging over the young Queen. Victoria's discomfort in her volatile state of mind, but in which moodiness and anguish prevailed, only made the atmosphere of the small circle of women worse. The meeting was going on with some tension and quite a bit of discouragement. "Your Majesty, does Lord Melbourne return today?" Harriet asked, trying to find a topic of conversation to ease the somber state of the crowd. "Yes, that he let me know by letter," Victoria replied, remembering with discouragement the brief message that Lord Melbourne sent her, devoid of the affection and charm he used earlier in his letters to her. "But I doubt if I see him today, to arrive exhausted and perhaps overwhelmed, though I'm not sure he'll come to see me tomorrow," Victoria added sombre and sadly, and her lips trembled as if she were to make pout and to burst into tears. "I'm sure William will come tomorrow, Your Majesty. I know him and I could swear it," Emma said sweetly, comfortingly. "I just happened to see a headline in this newspaper about William's trip to George's property. It seems to be a chronicle or something. Do you want me to read it, Your Majesty?" "It might be interesting," Emma added with interest in distracting Victoria. Victoria's mother rolled her eyes in a gesture of boredom, and the Queen did not seem particularly excited, but she did not seem to reject the idea either. "It's all right, my dear Emma. After all, there is nothing better to do. With my discomfort I have no desire to play cards, and to read puts me rather dizzy." "Please Emma, read it," Victoria replied. Emma smiled a friendly smile and began to read the chronicle. An introduction spoke of George's beautiful property and the arrival it from Lord Melbourne, and as both friends seemed very close. Then Lord George and Lord Melbourne went to this place in the meadow, where there were a pile of logs and axes. Lord George proposed to Lord Melbourne they cut logs, and he made a bet of a few pounds to see which of the two got tired first. That is very typical of George. When they was children he liked to challenge William with bets, and he is still childish," said Emma, interrupting the reading with a chuckle, which made Victoria smile with some sweetness, imagining Lord Melbourne as a child playing with his friend. So both men began to cut logs with the axes. A curious and amusing vision, that of two aristocrats accustomed to the salons of royalty and nobility, and in the case of Lord Melbourne to the corridors of Parliament and Palace no less than as Prime Minister, both powerful men chopping wood as the humble peasants. It was not long before both men started to sweat, and then Emma interrupted the reading, although by the gesture of her face it was evident that she continued reading in silence, and the expression of her face reflected a great surprise and even seemed to pale a little. Victoria watched her with interest and growing concern, trying to imagine what would have left Emma like this, distressed by what they might say of Lord Melbourne in the press. The other women also turned to see her with curiosity, and the Duchess, Leyson, and Harriet, who were sewing, temporarily left their tissues. "Emma, what's wrong? Please continue, do not make me nervous." "Whatever, I prefer to find out already," said Victoria, anguished and with some anger. "No, Majesty, it's nothing bad, it's just that, well, I'm coming," Emma replied, looking a bit embarrassed, and resuming her reading of the chronicle. Then Lord George had the idea of getting rid of their shirts. Lord Melbourne seemed reluctant, but then he accepted, convinced that he was in an intimate setting, away from curious stares. So Lord Melbourne took off his shirt and uncovered his torso. What a sight! Few people who have known Lord Melbourne, the right and elegant Lord Melbourne, the formal and modest Lord Melbourne, the man who until recently was Prime Minister and who is the presumed future husband of the Queen, could imagine that under his clothes is hidden. Emma hesitated a little. Hides an Adonis. Victoria gave a look of astonishment, her mother looked incredulous, and Lazon and Harriet looked a little bewildered. I do not exaggerate to say it. Lord Melbourne wore a wide chest, with powerful pecs, and a flat and hard belly. The entire front of his torso, from his strong shoulders to his stone belly through his magnificent pectorals, is a perfect set of athletic and fibrous muscles. His back broad V-shaped does not demerits from the front of his torso, as it is a strong back and manly. His arms are muscular, and they look powerful. His whole body from the neck to the waist looks sculptural to the naked, like the glorious torso of a gladiator, one of the fierce men who fought to death in the Roman circus. Harriet and Lazon were wide-eyed, amazed. Victoria wore a funny and comical gesture on her face, a gesture that reflected contradictory emotions, surprise, disbelief, excitement. Her open eyes showed deep interest, the blush on her cheeks reflected an embarrassing emotion. The Duchess saw her daughter sideways with curiosity and malice. But there are still other reasons for this analogy to be mentioned. As he continued to cut wood, the sweat poured down his back and his chest to fall to the belly and bottom to the back. Rivers of sweat gushed, from the pores of his suntanned skin, and they stroked down every inch of that same skin, running through hard pectorals like stones, running over athletes' muscles, until they reached the end of their path. It is not difficult to imagine that this vision would have been a heavenly dream for the beautiful goddess Aphrodite, who in Lord Melbourne would have found a new Adonis to overturn her lust. Nor is it difficult to imagine a sculptor of those who have carved the finest statues of the most beautiful Greek gods by drawing inspiration from the body of our beloved Lord Melbourne, for the body of the future consort of the Queen has nothing to envy to the body of the mythical Hercules. As she listened, Victoria's heart quickened and her breathing grew louder, and her face reflected a growing, hot excitement that the innocent Victoria could not conceal well. It may be thought that I exaggerated, but if you all had been present there would not doubt. Certainly it is difficult to imagine that under his luxurious and formal clothes Lord Melbourne can hide a manly beauty so portentous, although his great stature is a good indication. But that incredible vision was still missing. When Lord George gave up and ended the friendly competition between them, Lord Melbourne took a bucket of water and dropped his contents over his head. The water fell rudely on his head and descended shamelessly and savagely on his breast and his back of manly idol. The curls of his dark hair gleamed in the sunlight reflected in the drops of water, and then the handsome lord shook his head, throwing drops of water in all directions. As if it were a vision of the Iliad, sunbeams made their way through the twilight dusk clouds and reflected on that tanned skin, like that of a handsome romantic hero of the Mediterranean Europe, and the sweat and water created an illusion, as if someone had anointed oil on the powerful pectorals, on the muscles of his belly and his arms, on the broad and strong back, and surely under his pants he wore strong legs and muscular as the rest of his body. And then came to my mind a classic painting that represented Achilles victorious, standing on the body of his enemy Hector, and Achilles was naked, wearing a perfect body of man, muscular and beautiful in his figure and proportions, and his face reflected the terrible wrath of the warrior, and all of him was the living image of a demigod, a stallion on Olympus. Lord Melbourne looked like a vision that would make any damsel faint and sigh at any woman. Emma looked embarrassed when she finished reading, Harriet made an effort not to laugh while hiding her smile with a hand, Lazon looked scandalized and if she had been Catholic would probably be frantically crossing, and Victoria was red like a tomato, with a mischievous smile and sweet at the same time, and bright eyes, betraying the lustful thoughts that passed through her mind at that moment. The Duchess watched her daughter between amused and malicious, and with some envy. Well, Dina, you must be happier than ever to have chosen Lord Melbourne as your husband. I think you will be the envy of all the women of England, said the Duchess in mocking and malicious tones. "Mama!" cried Victoria ashamed. "It's true, Dina. After all, you will be married to an Olympian stallion with a beautiful, muscular body tanned by the sun," replied the Duchess, displaying a sense of humour strange in her. Harriet could not restrain herself and burst out laughing almost hysterically, and Emma could not help but catch, and began to laugh frantically. Victoria could not stay immune, and she also began to laugh more and more, thundering until tears came out in the middle of laughter, relaxing her sexual tension. The Duchess laughed as she had not for a long time, and even Lazen gave up her usual coolness and laughed. "Oh Mama! You made me laugh, as I did not laugh for a long time!" cried Victoria, wiping her tears away as she kept laughing. "You owe me laughter, Dina. But the blush on your cheeks is due to the visions of your beloved Lord Melbourne half naked," replied the Duchess, amused and wicked. "Mama!" Victoria protested, scandalized as she turned redder. "Come on, Dina. I was also your age, and I must admit that this story is right, even if it is very libidinous." "Lord Melbourne is a very handsome man," said the Duchess. "You think Lord M is very handsome?" exclaimed Victoria, surprised and disbelieving. "Of course, Dina. I have had my differences with Lord Melbourne in the past, and it is true that he and me are still not friends. And it is true that I am a little irritated by his personality, but I am not blind, and I am a woman with good taste, and I recognize that Lord Melbourne is one of the most handsome men I have met in my life, and I have met many. His face is very attractive, especially his beautiful eyes, and his body is very beautiful, a strong and virile body. I imagine you have noticed how he is dismounted of horse. Any woman, the pulse is accelerating by seeing his thighs and legs when dismounting," replied the Duchess. "Mama!" Victoria protested again, scandalized. "Dina, please. We are all grown women, you really are a very lucky woman to marry such a man, even though he is much older than you, although experience is also valuable." "I'm glad for you," said the Duchess. Victoria giggled nervously, and looked excited, embarrassed, and happy. "But who wrote such a shameless chronicle?" Victoria asked, still laughing, trying to divert the subject to other aspects less embarrassing for her. "He wrote it," Emma replied, looking in the header for the name of the chronicler, Richard Williams. "I understand. Really, why?" Victoria asked. "Well, it's just that, according to what I heard, this young Williams, the journalist, he's sodomite," Emma replied, embarrassed. "Sodomite? What is that?" Victoria asked, confused. Emma and Harriet exchanged uncomfortable looks. "Dina, a sodomite is a man who likes other men," replied the Duchess, who saw that her innocent daughter was still confused. "Is a man who feels for other men the same feelings and desires that women feel for men, is a man who can fall in love with other men and who wishes to share the bed with other men as women do," added Victoria's exasperated mother. Victoria made a gesture of revulsion and scandal on her face. "That exist?" Victoria exclaimed in disbelief. "Lazen, I should not have left Dina's education in regard to the relations between men and women, and matters of bedchamber, in your hands. Perhaps we would not have avoided some distastes," protested the Duchess as she turned to see Lazen, making a veiled reference to Victoria's pregnancy, while the Baroness reacted by blushing and angrily at her face. "Mama, do not be mean to Lazen. She did the best she could. Oh my God, there are so many things I do not know. But then, did this man see Lord M with the eyes of a woman?" said Victoria, who did not know whether to be disgusted or amused. "Of course, Dina. Do not you see what he talk about him as a female and he would talk about a stallion?" replied the Duchess with mockery and a certain disdain. "Mama!" Victoria exclaimed, looking down and laughing, while Emma and Harriet were laughing too. "I still have trouble recognizing Lord M in that chronicle. I mean, I do not doubt that his body, well, that his body is," tried to add Victoria, but she felt ashamed and could not find the right words. Beautiful and virile, like that of a Greek god? Asked the Duchess, amused. Yeah, well, although I would not use those words, maybe. I was talking about cutting wood like a humble peasant and half naked in the middle of the field, Victoria replied, though inside she felt horny, imagining the images of Lord Melbourne shirtless and bathed in sweat. That's George, Majesty. He knows which keys to play, how to manipulate William to do what he wants. And when they were both children, they were a bit wild, on the estate of George's family, or those, of William's family, they ran through the countryside, sometimes without a shirt or shirt open while playing such rude games. Later William matured a lot more, while George is still a bit childish for his age, but I think William likes his company so much because sometimes he makes him feel like a child again, and relieve the time when he was happy and he had no worries, Emma replied with tenderness and nostalgia. Victoria imagining sweetly Lord Melbourne, like a happy, wild child. But I'm sure this is not going to like anything him, Emma said a little amused. Meanwhile Lord Melbourne and George had arrived at George's house in London, and George was laughing as he read the Chronicle alone in a room, awaiting Lord Melbourne, who had made a brief visit to the bathroom. When Lord Melbourne entered the room, he was surprised to see his friend laughing alone. "What is so funny?" asked Lord Melbourne. "Nothing. Only that I'm so good, that sometimes I'm surprised myself. Are we leaving?" "Yes, I must pick that up before I go to Brocket Hall," said Lord Melbourne. When both men were about to leave George's mansion, Lord Melbourne's friend whispered in his ear to his butler. "Let the boys hasten to follow us," said George. "Sure, my lord," the butler answered with a slight smile. When Lord Melbourne and George descended from the carriage on a busy street in central London, a group of young men descended from another carriage. The boys dispersed in different directions. "Hey, is not that Lord Melbourne?" said one of the young people to another near a group of women so that they heard it. "Yes, it is him," the other pretended. The young men repeated the scene in different parts of the street, until the whole crowd learned that he was Lord Melbourne, and the women were excited. "Lord Melbourne, hot man!" shouted a relatively humble-looking woman. "What did that woman yell at me?" asked Lord Melbourne, puzzled as he searched the woman's face in the crowd. "Nothing. It must be some Tory who shouted a swear word," Lord George replied, suppressing his laughter. At that moment 3 young girls, barely younger than Victoria, dressed elegantly, like upper-class girls, approached Lord Melbourne and George, blushing and giggling. "Excuse me, sir, are you Lord Melbourne?" asked the boldest, but red as a tomato and trembling with emotion. "Yes, it is me, at your service," Lord Melbourne answered friendly and courteously. The girls laughed excitedly, and then one by one she introduced herself and offered her hand to Lord Melbourne to kiss her. When he kissed the back of each hand, every girl seemed to faint from the excitement. "Please, Lord Melbourne, you could sign me in this handkerchief as a souvenir of yours," asked the most daring of the girls by offering him a handkerchief, in what was perhaps the request of the first autograph in history. Lord Melbourne was puzzled, while George could not suppress his laughter. Lord George offered a writing pen that he went quickly to search to a nearby store, and Lord Melbourne signed the handkerchief. The girl took the handkerchief with her fingers and touched his hand with delight. Then a lady who was waiting nearby, frowning, approached. "Come on, young ladies. Do not continue to annoy Lord Melbourne," said the governess of one of them in annoyance. When the girls left, the owner of the handkerchief kissed it, and all the girls laughed. "Funny. My lady, I'm going to tell her mother," the governess scolded her. "George, what's wrong with people today?" asked Lord Melbourne, while his friend laughed. Lord Melbourne continued to notice the strange behaviour of the people until he finished his errands in the street and went to Brocket Hall, saying goodbye to George, who went to his own house. When he reached Brocket Hall, he talked to his butler in his library, before settling down to drink alone. "My lord, before I left, I wanted to suggest that you read this chronicle. I think you will find it interesting, the butler said, suppressing a funny smile. All right, I will, Robert. Thank you, you can retire, said Lord Melbourne kindly and with a smile. After a few minutes, Lord Melbourne settled into his favourite armchair with a glass of brandy and set out to read the newspaper's chronicle. As he read, his face turned red and covered himself with a gesture of anger. Damn you, George! I'm going to murder you! Exclaimed Lord Melbourne furiously.